Happy to have back on the show Professor Steven Levitsky, director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He co-wrote the book, How Democracies Die. We had him on to talk about that. He also co-authored with Daniel Zoblat the 2023 book, Tyranny of the Minority, which I read but never had you on to talk about. And you recently co-wrote an op-ed for the New York Times on about our democracy and what is going on. So, Professor Levitsky, nice to see you again. It's more darker times than in the past, but it's good to have you on.
It's happy to be here. I wish it were happier days.
Yeah, right before we started, I reminded you in 2021, I interviewed for Salon.com. It was during COVID. It was by Zoom. And you said then, I knew that Donald Trump would not accept the results of the election. What I did not anticipate is the vast bulk of the Republican Party would go along with it. And that was in October of 2021. That was, at the time, I think we both contemplated Donald Trump would be charged with some crimes and he might end up in a prison cell somewhere. And the GOP was lockstep then. What's your reaction now as we saw the guy get convicted of felonies, charged with espionage in another case, and still the base and the leadership and the elected officials all on board with this guy?
Yeah, I mean, that has been a crucial transformation, and it happened much more rapidly, more thoroughly than I anticipated. When we wrote How Democracies Die, this is now 8 years ago, we did not anticipate that. We thought that there would always be a faction of the Republican Party, a sort of Republican Party establishment that would be able to constrain Trump, that he would not ever gain full control over his party, because no president in living history has fully controlled his party in the United States. And so his ability to get to basically purge the party of dissidents and get the entire party in lockstep, when you have a two-party system and that party is capable of controlling both houses of Congress like it does now, that gives him an enormous amount of power. And I think it was really after January 6th, or after McCarthy's famous trip to Mar-a-Lago, and really importantly, the impeachment votes and the vote not to convict him in the Senate, McConnell's decision. That's where it became clear that that this party was going to be an accomplice to sort of any kind of authoritarian project that Trump came up with. That's when it became clear to me, much clearer than in the past, that this is a party that was capable of really converting itself into an authoritarian vehicle. And that's what it is today.
So in your view, the GOP is an authoritarian party, an anti-democracy party?
Yeah, we write in Tyranny of the Minority, we established three basic rules that any small d Democratic politician or party has to follow. To call yourself a committed Democrat, you got to do three things. You got to always accept the results of elections, win or lose. You have to always renounce political violence. And you have to always break ties with explicitly violent or anti-democratic forces. And the Republican Party no longer does any of those things. It's not just Trump.
Right. I remember writing articles in 2017 or 2018 about studies already showing how the Democratic Party as a party was still holding on to democratic norms in our nation, while the GOP was already beginning to slide. And they went back to like Mitch McConnell blocking Barack Obama to fill a Supreme Court seat as one of the big ones. And then, look, Democrats did gerrymandering too. Republicans took grotesque gerrymandering to a different level. But none of us saw what was going to happen after 2020. Well, look, you said what it indicated to you about the GOP. What does it indicate to you, not about all of America, but a subset of America, that they would want this man who attempted a coup, incited a terrorist attack, to be president of the United States?
Well, look, the Trump coalition, the 49.8% of the electorate that voted for Trump, can be divided, I think, into three camps. The largest group, the MAGA voters, which are, maybe it's 35%, roughly a third of the electorate, are in favor of this. They are in favor of an authoritarian project. They're doing this with their eyes open. They're cheering a lot of Trump's authoritarian behavior. There are two other groups that gave him victory, though, because that 35% alone is not enough It's not a majority of Americans. It's not remotely a majority of Americans. And it's not enough for him to win. There's a shrinking group of right-wingers, conservatives who really don't like Trump, but just hate the Democrats even more, and so will hold their nose and vote for Trump. The sort of Bill Barr category. That used to be a much larger group. It's shrinking, and then the group that put Trump over the top are not are politically inactive, independent, not very ideological folks who were just very unhappy with the status quo, and who were going to vote opposition in the 2024 election. And because we're a two-party system, and because the Republicans nominated Trump, they were not going to vote for the status quo, so they voted for Trump. And so it's not true that 49.8% of Americans are in favor of an authoritarian project. 49.8% pulled the lever for Trump, but I would say only about a third of the country is sort of appropriately characterized as authoritarian.
No, and I appreciate that analysis. That's really important because, and overall of all Americans, Trump got about 33% of eligible voters because about a third still stayed home, even though everyone running around saying, this is the most important election of our lives. So I'm like, I don't care. And this is what we have. And I'm chatting with Professor Steven Levitsky from Harvard University. So you co-wrote with two other people a recent op-ed a little over a week ago in the New York Times titled, "How Will We Know When We Have Lost Our Democracy?" And that might be shocking for some people, like, oh, we'll know it, but it's much more insidious. It is the frog in the boiling water type of scenario. Tell us what we are now. What are we? What is the United States?
I would say that we are what Luke and Wei and I call a competitive authoritarian regime. This is a political science term, but competitive authoritarian regimes are regimes in which there are free elections, the opposition exists, it's above board, it competes legally, there are competitive elections, but systematic incumbent abuse tilts the playing field against the opposition. Luke and I wrote this. So this is Hungary, it's Turkey, it's El Salvador today. It was Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. Now it's a full-scale dictatorship, but there have been a bunch of these regimes in the world, and Luke and I wrote a book about them 15 years ago. The U.S. is a very mild case of this, and it's reversible. We have not descended permanently into fascism, but we do argue in the Times piece, and we can get into why, that we have crossed the line. That if you took a snapshot today, and international democracy, organizations, institutions that measure democracy across the world, I think will agree with me. They will do this when they do their annual scorings. If you take a snapshot today, we are not quite at the level of full democracy anymore.
And you go through it in the article and lay out and summarize all the true weaponization of the government by Donald Trump. Just yesterday, there was literally reporting yesterday that there was an article in a publication owned by the same owner as Axios, a German publication, about Donald Trump Jr. Equating him to Hunter Biden. And that the reporting was, source reporting, that DOJ had reached out to the publication and said they weren't happy with it. And I don't know if it's true or not, but that is consistent with what we're living through in any event. So could you tell us a little bit about the traits that you could highlight that make us go from the democratic regime we were, the way we know a democracy in our republic, to a competitive authoritarianism?
Yeah, so look, the key difference is that in a competitive authoritarian regime, the incumbents systematically weaponize the machinery of government. The government is a big, powerful set of institutions. It does a lot of things, right? It collects taxes. It fights forest fires. It protects consumers. It provides national defense, policing. The government does a tremendous amount and has a lot of power and a lot of employees and a lot of resources. When authoritarian governments, particularly contemporary ones, 21st century authoritarians, what they do is they purge the key agencies of government, the ones that are responsible for arbitrating conflict, for investigating and prosecuting misbehavior, for collecting taxes, for making key regulatory decisions. They purge those institutions of professional civil servants. they pack them with political loyalists, and then they weaponize. They use those institutions not to carry out their public function, like predict the weather or, prevent crime, but rather to investigate, punish, bully, threaten their critics, their rivals, and business, media, and civil society. And that's happened in a very, very rapid way in the last 4 or 5 months. Whether it's DOJ or Department of Homeland Security or the FBI, key agencies of the state have been packed with political loyalists and turned into weapons. The Education Department is another one, turned into weapons against rivals. And it's being used to punish in different ways through investigations, through lawsuits, through arbitrary withholding of funding, through withdrawal of tax-exempt status, through a bunch of different mechanisms being used to punish those who have either spoken out against the government or are perceived to be in opposition to the government. And that is about as core an authoritarian behavior as you can find. That is what authoritarians do. Now, very quickly, how do you know you've sort of crossed the line? Well, it's very hard to tell. Citizens often can't tell. We in How Democracies Die, we quote a survey in Venezuela in 2011, 12 years into Hugo Chavez's presidency, that found that a majority of Venezuelans still thought they were living in a democracy. So it's hard to tell. The metric that we propose is that it should not be costly to peacefully oppose the government. Like in a democracy, it should be virtually costless for any of us to write an op-ed against the government, to publish a newspaper editorial or investigation of the government, to organize or join a protest, to give money to an opposition candidate, to speak out against the government, right? As long as you're engaging in peaceful, lawful behavior, opposing the government should not be costly. In an authoritarian regime, there is a cost to opposition, right? You could get audited. You could get investigated. You might get death threats. You could get a key regulatory, an arbitrary regulatory decision against your company. You could get $2.2 billion of funding illegally withheld, like Harvard did. And what we argue is that now for hundreds of thousands of Americans, they have to think twice about expressions of opposition to the government because they know now there's a real risk of some form of government retribution. And the fact that hundreds of thousands of Americans are thinking twice about legal, peaceful, democratic acts of opposition because they fear government retribution, to me, that is slam dunk evidence that we're no longer living in a fully democratic regime.
Yeah, I recently interviewed Marshall Dursis, from Germany, who wrote a book about how tyranny falls. And, he talked about how, and he wasn't about Trump at all. This book came out in 2024. It was not about this world, about the use, though, of tyrants and aspiring dictators of selective repression. And that's what it seems like we're seeing, as opposed to broad repression, where that's going to cause a natural backlash. If Trump puts the troops in the street and actually puts down people, some Americans, it's in our DNA, I think, at least I hope it is, to rise up against that. But selectively going after ABC, going after a law firm, going after Ivy League schools, and the like, former people like Christopher Krebs, it doesn't affect people personally. They can still go to a Tesla dealership on Saturday and protest. Are you worried that the selective things gives the rest of us the illusion, like the people in Venezuela, that, hey, everything is still kind of okay. We can go outside of a Tesla dealership and yell, and no one comes for me after the protest.
Yes. I mean, that is precisely one of the great dangers of competitive authoritarianism is it's done incrementally. It's done in a way that is at least nominally legal, usually, because Pam Bondi is going to sign off on it. And it is done in a selective manner. In fact, I think it may be the case that Trump is overreaching and they're targeting too many people too quickly, which could well trigger exactly the kind of reaction that you just alluded to. But in theory, and in the first few months, we were terrified of this, and we wrote about this in the New York Times piece, that other universities see what happens to Columbia, and rather than speak out, they crawl into a defensive shell.
Mhm.
And law firms see what happens to a couple of major law firms, and rather than speak out and mobilize, they make some concessions, and everyone enters into a mode of individual self-preservation. All of civil society, which means that the most powerful members of our civil society, our universities, our leading media, our CEOs, our churches, NGOs, foundations, the muscle that is our civil society, so many of them, because of fear of being targeted, step back, silence themselves, or just retreat to the sidelines. And that's, I think, where US society's been in the spring of 2025. I think there's evidence that we're beginning to emerge from it and fight back, but we really responded with a whimper as a society to Trump's authoritarian offensive in the spring of 2025.
What would you like to see? Like, what would have been, and I mean, not personally, from a historical point of view, as someone who's covered this, that would show that people are not going to take it. It's just not going to take root here the way that Trump and MAGA wanted to.
I would have liked to see it. And again, I don't want to downplay how difficult this is,
I
but
understand.
what I would have liked to see is as soon as Columbia got attacked, all the other Ivy League and 20 leading universities get together and make a public denunciation of what is happening and commit themselves to refuse to accept these demands. I would have liked to see all the major law firms line up in opposition to making the kinds of to the kind of acquiescence that a handful of law firms did. I would have liked to see major CEOs, those who can afford it, like Jeff Bezos, who knows better and says so in private, to stand up and oppose the government, even if there is some cost to be paid, because democracy isn't free, right?
Mhm.
You can't have everything you want and have your democracy too when there's an authoritarian in power. And I would have liked to see those who have the influence and the power and the privilege that they can withstand a blow or two from the government, like Harvard, like Jeff Bezos, like Paramount. I would have liked to see them stand up rather than acquiesce.
That's a great point. And I, as a lawyer myself, I was very disappointed seeing some of the law firms acquiesce. But then I spoke to a few law firms here in New York, including the Ropes firm, which I think is actually representing Harvard in some of the litigation now, who were proud in defying Trump. A bunch of them, and even some were cited in executive order on DEI, and they're like, "Nope, not come for us, but we're standing strong." You co-write in the article about appeasement, about the fatal logic of appeasement. I'd love you to tell people, because it's a point I keep making to people, that if you're in a group that the MAGA base hates, your appeasement's going to buy you time at best, because they're going to come for you. So what is the fatal logic of appeasement?
Um, it is the belief. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of naivete, particularly. I mean, many Americans to this day are still have a mindset that it can't possibly happen here, that we're sort of genetically a democracy, and we can't really be authoritarian. So Trump can't really be doing what he appears to be doing. And so with that mindset, there's this belief that if you negotiate and make some concessions and kind of acquiesce to their sort of inappropriate demands right now, that they'll go away, they'll leave you alone, you'll survive, and you'll be better off tomorrow. Without thinking of the collective, first of all, because if everybody makes that acquiescence, which is what happened in February and March, Trump steamrolls civil society, but also not understanding that if you're, as you said, a group, an actor that the MAGA folks is opposed to, they're going to come after you. And
Mhm.
in general, I mean, I don't want to overstate this comparison, but the logic of the bully does mainly work here, right? Concessions to a bully are a sign of weakness and only invite further demands. And that is exactly what Trump did to Columbia and to the initial law firms. You concede, and you not only sacrifice your own ability to be part of a resistance, but you're just inviting further bullying down the road.
And you mentioned it's not easy to always stand up. There's a price to be paid. And at Harvard, where you were a professor, Donald Trump has targeted taking billions of dollars away. And there's a cost already. What can you share, whatever you're comfortable with, how the real world impact of Donald Trump targeting a university has been?
Just in the last few weeks, dozens of my colleagues have received word that their research projects are being canceled. This is cancer research. This is Parkinson's disease. This is the cutting edge medical research that saves and extends people's lives. It's also physics research, all sorts of cutting edge scientific research, which is one of the things that makes America a leading economy and leading society in the world. Professors who are the best in the country at their job are being told that their research projects are ending, are having to be suspended. Institutions across the university, I run the Center for Latin American Studies, are being told to prepare for massive budget cuts, of up to 20% across the board, which means we're going to have to be laying off people across the board. This is affecting thousands of people's lives.
And what Donald Trump has done, and I'd love you to
for nothing, right? For nothing.
Well, look, you invoked Hungary, Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban's come after the educational system in Hungary. The Chinese Communist Party runs the education system. Why is that? So people understand that this is part of the authoritarian playbook. Why is going after education institutions like Harvard, Columbia, and the big ones and across the country part of that playbook?
That's a great question, an important one, because it's really important to be clear that this is not about anti-Semitism. This is not about DEI, whatever you may think of DEI. This is what authoritarians do. Authoritarians of the left, like López Obrador in Mexico, Chavez in Venezuela, of the center, like Bukele was in El Salvador, of the right, like Orban, Erdogan, they all go after universities. Why? Universities inevitably, no matter what the color or the ideological stripe of the government, universities are independent centers of dissent. Professors and students are natural dissenters. They're places of public criticism. They also tend, at least in Western democracies, they tend to be pretty influential culturally, particularly elite private universities. And so you have culturally influential centers of dissent. Authoritarians don't like that. And they almost invariably, it's very hard to find an autocrat that hasn't gone after universities. So this is not some unique thing that has to do with October 7th or has to do with DEI overreach since the Black Lives Matter protests. This is what every authoritarian government does. Donald Trump is doing what every authoritarian that I can think of in the 21st century has done, going after universities.
And that's important because this is all from a playbook. There's the expression, the banality of evil. There's also the banality or the unoriginality of authoritarianism. And what they do, Project 2025 is like Hungary in a book form. So based on that.
They learn from Orban. This is why they love Orban. They learn from him. So why does Hungary get so much attention? Hungary is a tiny country. It's an insignificant country. But Viktor Orban taught the Republicans. He actually taught a Republican Party that used to be Reaganite, in which the government was the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Viktor Orban taught Republicans to love the government because you can weaponize the government and deploy it against your rivals. You're right, it's a playbook that these guys learned from Orban.
And it goes through education, media, political opponents, the illiberal democracy that Viktor Orban wanted. So based on what you've seen here, what do you think, to give people a picture of coming attractions, what do you think we should expect from the Trump regime going forwards in terms of this playbook?
Look, in some sense, it's hard to know for a couple of reasons. First of all, Trump is very erratic, and his cabinet is not very smart or savvy. And we're fortunate in many respects for that. I mean, if Trump had the discipline and the political savviness of Orban, we'd be in even greater danger than we are. Trump's first few months were straight out of the authoritarian playbook in some ways. I mean, in the sense that he purged and packed key agencies of the state and converted them, FBI, DOJ, the FCC, the INS, the IRS, excuse me, Homeland Security, the Education Department. All of these have been weaponized and deployed in a routine, systematic, daily way against rivals. That was predictable. He's done it, I think, more rapidly than many of us expected. One thing that's not entirely out of the authoritarian playbook, even more radical than Orban, Erdogan, is this apparent willingness to defy the law and the courts entirely. The lawlessness of this government is really kind of breathtaking. Orban packed the courts, so he was able to do, when you got the courts on your side, you can do things legally pretty easily. And Trump is not able to pack the courts. Our judiciary, it continues to be quite independent and quite strong. And so this government is signaling a willing and has begun to defy the courts. And people don't really realize this, but the strategy is, and Justice Brown Jackson actually called it catch me if you can strategy of law breaking. Rather than obey the law, which is what you do when you have a rule of law in your country, they are breaking the law until they get stopped. Right? They are knowingly violating the law until somebody stops them. Now, it may be that eventually they do get stopped. Could be a month, 6 months, 12 months down the road, but they're going to break the law until somebody stops them, which means that they will get away with some things. They will break things irreparably before they're stopped in many cases. I mean, to the best, I'm not a lawyer, but to the best of my knowledge, the withdrawal of funding from Harvard, which is congressionally appropriated funding, completely illegal. And we may win in court. I don't know when we'll win in court, but we're laying people off and, destroying decades of research in the meantime. So this law breaking, we don't know how far it'll go, how far Trump will take that strategy, but it is ruinously destructive. One of the great things that this country has, Americans, I don't think always realize it. One of the reasons why we've had 250 years of prosperity and relative stability, relative peace in this country, and we don't have coup d'etats every 10 years, and we're not living in misery, is because we have a really strong rule of law. It's not the water, it's not the air, it's not the American DNA. We built this country, this economy, this society on a foundation of a rule of law, and Trump is breaking that. And that's, in many respects, I think, worse than Hungary and Turkey. What I think is hard to anticipate is, Trump has lost some support. The economy is very unstable. There are a lot of different variables floating about, and we don't know how Trump will respond to them. And in particular, just to focus on one thing, if Trump continues to lose support, which I think is quite possible, and things are looking dire for the midterms, he could go in one of two ways, and I can't predict which. He may end up sort of being tamed and being kind of compelled to back off and sort of moderate, maybe more like his first term in office, or he may radicalize and try to steal the election. Both of those things are possible, and it's impossible to predict which route he will go.
After 2020 and after him inciting a terrorist attack on our capital and then pardoning the terrorists, nothing's off the table. Anything.
Correct.
And what's very sinister is Donald Trump signed 100 and almost 50 executive orders. He knew many would be struck down by the court. It was win-win for him. If they don't get struck down, he gets to re-envision America. If they get struck down, he goes to his base and says, look at these radical liberal judges to try to delegitimize the entire judiciary. The only last thing holding him from being the king that he wants to be like in the Middle East. He loves that. That pomp and certain, to me, that's the sinister, the next step in this chess game, if you call it chess, whatever you want. He knows his base better than anyone. He knows he can go to them and say, don't listen. The courts are meaningless. You were told they were real. They're not. They're radical left people. We can ignore the court orders. And I bet you, I have great confidence that the MAGA base would be completely on board with that. I just wonder how many other fellow Americans won't be and what they will do to push back. That's the question. Will they flood the street? Will we massive protests, stop work, national strikes? Will we do any of that? Or as Americans, we're just going to sit back and post about it on social media and go back our business? Because then that brings me to almost the last thing here. You talk about in your article, America's slide into authoritarianism is reversible, but no one has ever defeated autocracy from the sideline. So give us the remedy before we wrap up. What do we got to do?
Look, I think we have to work on at least three fronts. And they're obvious. You know, one is the courts. The courts are really important. The courts will not save us on their own, but they're very, very important. So Harvard is rightfully working through the courts to defend itself, and as are many, many, many actors in society. Elections continue to be incredibly important. They're not for another year and a half, but the elections will be very, very important in 2026, and again, obviously in 2028. But then various forms of protest are critical. I mean, courts do not act in a vacuum, and major actors in civil society, Jeff Bezos, Harvard's president, nobody acts in a vacuum. And if we're all huddled on the sidelines, terrified, and nobody's really speaking out, judges will be influenced by that. Major civil society actors will be influenced by that. If there's a climate of pushback, if people are regularly pushing back there are many, many different ways to do that. I'm not necessarily talking about mass street protests, although that might be part of it. People showing up at congressional town halls, people showing up at local meetings, the media, they're writing simple letters to members of Congress. There are lots of different ways to shape public opinion and shape the public debate. But there needs to be, in addition to the courts, in addition to elections, there has to be public pushback, civic pushback on 1,000 different fronts.
And very last thing, you know, in that interview 5 years ago at Salon, you said to me, and this was 2021, October, you said, if you would have said to me 5 years ago, our democracy could end, I would laugh at you. That was in 2021. Where are you now?
As I said, I think our democracy has ended. I mean, I think it's only, again, it's a very, very mild form of authoritarianism, and I think it's very reversible. In fact, I think fairly confident we will reverse it. But Lucan and I wrote our first article about competitive authoritarianism it was published in 2002. We wrote it in 2001, the year of 9/11. And there was a lot of debate about the Bush administration, the Patriot Act. A lot of progressives thought the Bush administration was usurping a lot of power. There was a certain amount of fear. So people asked us when we wrote this piece 25 years ago, they asked us, you know, could the United States be a competitive authoritarian regime? And we said, no way. No way. And here we are.
And who knows where we're going to be in 2 years or 25 years. I hope that we can continue to have these conversations if we're allowed by the regime, or we'll have them in a camp or big holding cell together. We'll talk there. But Professor, thanks so much for making time and chatting with me about this. I really admire your work. And, you know, hopefully in a few months from now, we can chat again. Maybe there'll be some positive things. But thanks, and keep up the fight at Harvard. It's an inspiration. For not just history is going to look at you guys and doing the right thing. You're inspiring people today, and it's so vitally important. So thank you and everyone at Harvard for standing up.
Thanks, Dean. It's good to see you.